So, Eric, tell me about pre-game movements.
Yeah, so pregame movements are a really big part of the game, and they're a huge advantage for whoever has them. They allow you to do quite a number of things. They allow you to do things such as manipulate your opponent's deployment. They allow you to play more aggressively in certain cases or play more defensively in certain cases without really punishing you. The other thing that should also be considered a pregame movement is redeploys. They're sort of the same ilk. They allow you to do something in the deployment phase and not be committed or married to it and readjust based on where you see your opponent go. And even the fact that you have pregame moves affects where your opponents can go. So pregame moves are really important due to the fact that they kind of can dictate the deployment phase for your opponent, and they can also help you take the largest advantage of your deployment phase.
Hmm. So, a couple things that I noted from that one is that one of the reasons why pre-game moves are so important, and same with changing deployments, is that you get to make the decision after you've figured out who goes first or second, and that allows you to have a type of threat of activation. For example, if I have Death Company that can move 12 inches pre-game move and then move 12 inches in my turn, just knowing the fact that they can do that forces you to deploy differently because you don't know if you're going to get that first turn or not before I get to make the decision.
Exactly. So, like you said, you can use them as a threat, essentially, saying, "Hey, before the game begins, I can move these up to 12 inches," and deployment happening prior to prior to the roll off, someone has to consider that the entire time they're deploying, and that can manipulate their decisions and make them deploy more defensively. But the other side to that is you can use pre-game movements defensively as well. You can do things like redeploys and pre-game movements, such as you can block some of your opponent's infiltrating deployments. So take infiltrating troops and stuff like that, things like Nurglings or like Incursors and certain troops that allow you to, or elites that are allowed to deploy outside of your deployment zone. Most of these infiltrations have restrictions of 9 inches away from your opponent's deployment zone and 9 inches away from opponent's models. So one of the things you can do, knowing that you have a pregame move or a redeploy, is you ask your opponent, "Hey, do you have any infiltrators? Do you have anything that can deploy outside your deployment zone, or do you have any pregame moves?" And if they say yes, and you have the first deployment, you can sit there and, such as an example, deploy directly in the middle of the board is one of my favorite things to do. If I know I can redeploy this unit, I'm not losing anything. Deploying in the middle of the board usually leaves that unit out in the wind and makes them very vulnerable to attacks. But what this does now is if you deploy them in the middle, and in fact, you can even go up to the 9 inches away from your opponent's deployment zone, right? And you're only going to be, because the dead man zone between two deployment zones generically is about 24 inches. So if you're 9 inches from their deployment zone, then you're going to be 15 inches from yours. If there's any restriction on they can't be within 9 inches of your deployment zone, which is very common, and they can't be within 9 inches of your model, a 15-inch dead zone in between is going to make it to where basically they're restricted from deploying across most of this really valuable centerpiece area, right? Now, they might be able to deploy over here per se and whatnot, um, and get up in this corner. But on your next appointment, if you have another infiltrator and you measure about, I usually go with 15 inches out because you want to compensate for angles and whatnot. But generally speaking, if they have to be 9 inches away from each restricted area or restricted model or unit, then every 18-inch gap in between your two units is an area that's suppressed from being deep struck into or infiltrated into. And so with that, obviously that gap gets larger as you start going in further angles away. But like I said, I generally stay about 15 inches away. That covers most of the area. And at this point, between these two units here, I've now blocked a good portion of the board.
Yeah, I think that's something that people don't talk about nearly enough when they're talking about, deployment phase and pregame moves and things like that, is that by putting these forward deploying units out, you're not just, having them be within threat range of your opponent, but you're also denying your ability for your opponent to, forward deploy near you as well. So there's a lot of denial you can do with that, and any redeployment shenanigans you
Exactly.
have are much more powerful on units that can forward deploy.
It's a really solid strategy. It definitely limits your opponent in a lot of cases. And then when you have redeploy, right, or you have pregame movements, especially with multiple units redeploying, such as some factions have like 3 units can redeploy. You can put these out there, wait for the roll off. Oh, I got the roll off. I'll redeploy in a sense with a little more aggression. Um, Generally speaking, though, what if you don't get the roll off? The big advantage to the redeploy at that point is okay. Well, I've restricted my opponent's deployment phase now, but now that the deployment phase is over, let's do some redeploys and let's get these guys out of danger and get them back here where they're not going to just get eaten immediately. So that's a really way to use it defensively. Another big way to use redeploys or pregame movements defensively is if we take a look at this table setup, right? This terrain. And another big part of movement in general is move blocking. Now, uh, infantry, beasts, and swarms can go through this terrain, right? However, things like monsters. I myself am a big demons player, and I play very large demons. I enjoy them a lot. So a thing that some more competent players can do, such as Necrons, they can pregame move some stuff. And Scarabs have very large bases. They're 40 mil bases, and they're usually taken in. They're either taken in really big swarms, or they're taken usually like in 3s to 5s. If you have a 5-man swarm of Scarabs, right? Keep in mind coherency is 2 inches. If coherency is 2 inches, and you have 5 bases that are 1.5 inches, that means from the furthest most right side of one base to the furthest most right side of another base is 3.5 inches. Multiply that by 5, you have about 17.5 inches of coverage at that point. The reason that's important, and I know that seems like, throwing out ridiculous numbers, but you can have over 18 inches of gap in between 2 terrain pieces. And if you pregame move your Scarabs up as such, something like that, you can cover a very large margin of area where the gap is that something like a vehicle, a monster, or any other large thing that isn't able to go through walls or fly has to go through that gap. Well, at this point, you've now blocked up the one gap they can shoot through. And especially if you have multiple units, then you can block up multiple gaps. And with that, keep in mind, you can block that up. They get the movement. That's fine. They move forward with something like a Keeper of Secrets, which can absolutely end up moving 20 plus inches in a turn. And now they're stopped by these Scarabs. And if you're really making sure you're doing your math right and all that, sure, the Scarabs can get shot, psychicked, and a number of other things to cause wounds to pick their bases up. However, keep in mind they have to stay outside of an inch of you, right here, and you deploy a unit exactly 11.1 inches from the front of your base on this model right here. At that point, they have to stop 12.1 inches away from this model here, this thing you don't want them to get into, right? So if they're 12.1 inches away, it doesn't matter if all of these get picked up. This is no longer a legal charge because you are 12.1 inches away. You can't declare something that's over 12 inches away. So by blocking their movement and sacrificing the Scarabs through a pregame movement, you have now forced them to take a turn to only cash in on however many points that those Scarabs were worth, with a huge, a very huge threat. And they can't get to a lot of these really juicy targets in the back that they wanted to. And with being 12.1 inches away, when it's your turn, say it's something that has Meltas on it or something. Well, guess what? Now you're right there in Melta range immediately or in Flamer range. So pregame moves can also do something for you defensively while at the same time setting you up for the next turn offensively.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate too, like kind of why that works. So you can't end your movement. You can't end your movement within engagement range, which is a 1 inch engagement range of an enemy model. So basically, if you have your own two models that are 11.1 inches away from each other, from front to front to base, then your opponent would have to be 1 inch away at minimum from your top model. Therefore, they're 12.1 inches away. And even if a model can make a 18-inch charge, like 3d6 +2 from a litany, they're not eligible to declare a target if it's not within 12 inches. So that is a very, very smart play.
Yeah, it 100% can change how a game is played. It can 100% give you the opportunity to actually take a what would normally be a bad matchup for you and turn it around into a great matchup as long as you're using terrain. And that's why we also have things. Some people run units that are less in points but take up a large body area because they're willing to sacrifice a 70 point, rhino or something like that to push it forward and put it in between somewhere and block your movement for a turn, because cashing in 70 points to make my 230 or 240 points do essentially nothing worthwhile is absolutely worth it for the turn. But that's a big factor of the pregame movement. And as long as you combine it with smart deployment, and I'll say this on a warning on pregame movement. Do not think because you have a pregame movement that you can deploy recklessly, right? You should deploy as though you don't have one anyways. And the reason I say that is because, well, for the most part, unless a plan specifically requires you to deploy them in a certain way with the pregame movement. But normally, if you deploy properly, um, and you don't have to use the pregame movement, well, you just saved yourself command points, which are extremely valuable in the game, as everybody should know. But two, the other thing is keep in mind, you may not be the only one with pregame movements. And based on that, if you're relying on your pregame movements to stakes while you're using their pregame movements to take larger advantage, you will, in that now instead of using your pregame moves to create new opportunities, using pregame moves to fix, which is a good benefit of pregame moves, but not something you should inherently lean into.
Okay, so I got a kind of a question on some pre-game moves. So let's say we're playing against a kind of the classic tournament, Ultramarines tournament list, where they have Redemptors and Victor tactical warsuits, so they can forward deploy and then also redeploy 3 of their units, and they have some good long range firepower. Obviously, we want to be as matchup agnostic as we can, but I think that's one of the most popular ones in the meta right now. How do you play against an army that you know can do a massive amount of pregame movements and redeployments?
I inherently deploy fairly defensively. And the reason is that if you factor in pregame movements or redeployments, say they have a lot of firepower that can shoot around buildings and shoot around angles, then well, they can move around buildings and angles to get the shots on people, right? So I might deploy my stuff back here, and considering how many demons I run and whatnot, I can keep a couple of them safe. But if I run 6 large demons typically. If I deploy all like this, right, then I'm going to be pretty much safe from any angle. However, I've just sacrificed all of my offensive presence with these two. They are not going to be fast enough to go from one corner of the board to the next. And maybe I can do that and launch them in waves, but in most cases, I'm not trying to sacrifice that offensive presence. So, what you can do, however, is when you look at this board, and say, let's just pretend they have a bunch of Volkite contenders. Let's pretend the rule of 3 doesn't exist, and we have 45-inch range Volkite contenders all over on this board. As we're deploying, I see that I can deploy in a very safe way with these models here and these demons here. These two, however, are presenting a problem of I could deploy like here and I could deploy, back here, but there's chances of them going, okay, well, I'm going to redeploy, multiple things over here and shoot this angle and whatnot. But keep in mind, when it comes to those redeploys and like how we talked about with restrictions before and whatnot, there's only so much they can fit, one. And two, the other thing you can set up for is in this particular scenario, if they want to get the highest offensive presence against me, right? They are going to deploy pretty similar to this fashion. If they really want to get the angles on that one keeper of secrets right there, we'll say it is, or Bellicor or whatever it may be. Chances are they'll deploy something like this if they have the option to redeploy, say, everything. Um, so with their 8-inch movement, that allows them to get up here, shoot this angle, possibly over here. This one might not be able to make it, but these ones all should be able to make it and shoot that angle and whatnot, right? So, and they can get 5 in line. Now, the key to this is that in order to allow them to be offensive on a keeper of secrets or this one person who's out here, it's essentially you're luring them out. You're giving them, bait. And that'll be a common thing you'll see a lot of players do is they'll hope that someone takes the bait. They'll be like, this is a really good target. People are going to want it. But now at this point, in order to get this angle on this one, sure, this one gets eliminated. But by moving closer, and I've deployed heavily under the cover of this piece right here, and they're that close, I can very easily get multiple keeper of secrets from over here into here. And now at this point, sure, I lost one of my 6 big demons, but now threatened and possibly killed 3 of your big moneymakers that you were trying to get angles on. So it is difficult, and again, you're inherently going to be in a disadvantage or a bind if you don't have redeploys because of the fact that they get to take the most advantage of that phase. But if you play the game tightly, you use your, you sit there and look. Don't just look at the terrain on your side of the board, right? So just because I only have this terrain to hide behind directly doesn't mean I don't have more terrain. There is all sorts of terrain. This one right here, this one right here, and whatnot. And so look further up the board as well, because sometimes terrain will be placed in such a manner that if, they deploy heavily on this side and you're up over here, it is unlikely that this model here can move enough because once it moves across to here, it's still got to contend with this piece of terrain right here. So yes, you're not fully covered by the terrain he's directly, your model's directly by, but you're covered by this terrain right here further up the board. Utilizing terrain is going to be the number one thing with your deployment and trying to mitigate those pregame moves and whatnot.
Yeah, one thing I think that I really like that you talked about there is, your opponent has the ability to do their pregame moves and redeployments, and you can't stop it. But what you can do is put yourself in a position to punish them for using them. So essentially, maybe kind of use some of your models as bait, but knowing how their pregame movements and their redeployments work allows you to try to set up to take advantage of their movements if they use them.
Absolutely.
Okay, so that will kind of conclude our pregame movement and redeployment.